Well, Lyndon's the seminar person.
Oh, yeah. So you have to introduce yourself.
Hello, today I'll be playing the role of Lyndon, and I will be the host and moderator of the seminar session. Can people online hear me? Okay, Matt's giving me a thumbs up. So welcome everybody. It's snowing in Blacksburg. I don't know if it is where other folks are, but it's really nice to see we have a ton of people online, which is really exciting. I'm going to pass it to Cora and Daniel, who are going to introduce Lyndon, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Oliver. I needed that. So today is my pleasure to introduce Lyndon Frommer for his dissertation seminar on the selling of trans medicine. Lyndon started his journey here after gaining a master's degree in integrative social science from Arizona State University in 2020. At ASU, Lyndon wrote his thesis on the impacts of policy related to reducing school shootings. As part of his work at ASU, Lyndon published his first co-authored paper on university design. He has since co-authored 2 more papers with folks here at Virginia Tech. As a graduate student, he's excelled in other ways too. He has been the instructor of record of 4 courses, served in numerous graduate assistant positions, played multiple roles within the STS GSO and GSA, and he is engaged in outreach and service beyond the university. Recently, Lyndon was invited to Southern Methodist University to host a workshop on medicine and STS for students and faculty. Lyndon has already impacted the larger STS community through his work across research, teaching, and service, and it has been a pleasure to work with him. Daniel.
Yes, so you're about to hear one slice of a bigger project that Lyndon is wrapping up, but I want to say a little bit about that project to convey our sort of frenzied excitement about it. We all know something about the very public battles over gender-affirming surgery, but Lyndon shows us how access to this care, the very definition of the care, what it includes, who pays for it and how much, and who deserves it, has been the subject of a grinding struggle over decades. In what looks like the routine work of healthcare administrators, providers, insurance companies, lawyers, and courts, which you'll hear about today, and finally, and importantly, those seeking this care, how they try to become agents in this struggle, not by lobbying or protesting, but in their everyday acts as patients, defining their needs for themselves and trying to access the care that they need. So it's really a wonderful example of, the best of STS, how our tools and perspectives help uncover what's at stake, in this case, the very right to care, in all of this technical, legal activity. And it's Lyndon's study both studies that struggle, but importantly represents an important intervention in it. And I think you'll see that in the talk, so take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely words, and thank you all for coming today. It is a real pleasure to get to share this work with you all. And a little surreal to be up in front of you all, especially being in charge of helping to put all this together. Sending the email this week was a little weird, not gonna lie. Yeah, so the title of this talk is Selling of Trans Medicine, and just a little bit of background of it about this particular part of my work. It's my chapter 1, so it's a historical chapter. Like Daniel was kind of talking about, I go through the legal history of trans people basically suing and advocating for themselves to have their care covered by insurance companies. But it's part of a larger project where I'm trying to answer how do trans people value gender affirmative surgeries and gender affirmative care, and how much are they a part of this evaluation process, and how can we further recognize the agency of trans people within this care. And so throughout my dissertation, I use a mixed method approach. I use legal archives to look at these court cases to first see how the arguments and value for this care is initially created. And then I go into more of a content analysis in my chapter 2, where I discuss the current market as it is today, and so how people actually navigate the system, the different forces that act on their ability to navigate that system, and how they eventually are able to receive that care. And then in my chapter 3, I start to interview trans people, and I actually ask them what they think about it. How do they perceive this care, and what does it mean in their lives? And so I'll eventually, still working on it, wrap this whole project back up in thinking about how do we evaluate the value that has been created for trans people, and how do we put that into conversation with how trans people actually see these procedures themselves. And so by the end, I want to start a new conversation about what does it mean to have this kind of care, what does it mean to be trans, and how do you be trans without being pathologized. And so, yeah, but today I want to jump into the historical part. So we're going to go to the year of 1975. And that's why the Brady Bunch was a little bit of a hint at what we'll be getting into. But I want to go into a TV show that went from 1969 to 1976. It's called The Medical Center. And it was just your regular medical drama TV show. They went in the daily lives of a bustling medical center in the 60s, or in the 70s mainly, and go over the dilemmas, the drama between the different folks in that center. But I want to draw attention to one particular episode. It aired in 1975. It was titled The Fourth Sex. And in that episode, we have a guest star of, we have Robert Reed, who you guys all may know is the beloved father from the Brady Bunch, and he plays a trans woman. And in the episode, we see, her name in the episode is Pat, and Pat is a well-known surgeon that was working at the medical center at the time, or was working at the medical center, but eventually went away. And I didn't watch the whole series, so fans of the medical center, come at me. But basically, Pat came back in this episode to try to get care from the medical center, try to get her surgery done by the folks at this medical center. And part of this whole show is that this is the best medical center. It's in LA, it's state of the art. But I want to draw attention to a few things that came up in this episode. First, there's a lot of medical uncertainty within all the folks in this medical center that are trying to provide this care to Pat. And then there's also instances of class and educational privilege that Pat has. Because Pat is a surgeon, she knows how to get the care, what to ask for, and how and is able to just pay for it. There's no concern about how she's going to pay for it. She just knows it's going to happen, and that doesn't ever come up in the episode. And then it also focuses on the concern of cisgender people. At no point is Pat's concerns or dilemmas or frustrations ever brought up. It's always focused on her future ex-wife, her son, her ex-colleagues, and it's never put back on Pat's expertise as a surgeon or even as a trans person within her own body. It completely disregards Pat's expertise. And I bring this up because it lines up pretty well. This episode showcases pretty well where we're starting in this history of trans people advocating and suing for their access to having their insurance and Medicaid pay for their surgeries. And so throughout this presentation, you'll see instances of legal uncertainty by providers. You'll also see instances where, these surgeries are expensive. So during this time, even though these surgeries were starting to become more accessible to people, they were still expensive, and being able to navigate the system, to be able to access it, was a challenge, and going to places that actually had this care was also a challenge. Also, throughout this conversation, there's oftentimes they'll focus on the legal proceedings, focus on what the taxpayers, quote unquote, the taxpayers are concerned about, rather than whether or not this care is appropriate for trans people. And then, additionally, the testimony of trans people is almost entirely excluded from the conversation. Anytime there's evidence, it's always the expertise stating for the trans people that this is something that they need. And so that's just kind of to be able to set it up for you guys. But a little bit more about what I'll be going through. So, like I already said, this is cases between trans people and the insurance providers. Basically, they're lawsuits I started looking between 1970 up to 2016. I picked those times for a few reasons. First of all, that was 1975, I believe, was the first court case that a trans person actually sued for their insurance or Medicaid to pay for their insurance. And then I chose 2016 because it's about 6 years after the Affordable Care Act was passed, which was the time when part of the Affordable Care Act was that insurance and Medicaid would be required to pay for trans people's surgeries if you were going to be part of the Medicaid system. And then also that was Trump's first term, and I just didn't want to have to deal with some of the minutia of Trump. A little bit more about the overview of the presentation. So I'll be giving kind of a brief history of what's kind of set up for trans people to be even able to advocate and sue for their right to have access to this care. And then I'll go into what I'm calling the sales pitch, which is basically the different values that are put into these court cases or argued for in these court cases to make it so that to basically make these arguments for whether or not trans people should be able to access this care. And then I'll go over a few court cases that I thought were kind of juicy and kind of showcase what I'm trying to show you all, and then I'll talk a little bit about values today. So brief history. So the first, in 1965, we have the passing of Title, there's that 19, Title 19 of the Social Security Act, but this is also called the Medicaid and Medicare Act. But basically, this was leading up to this point. If you had any type of insurance, it was only through your either employer. Sometimes labor unions provided it, but up till that point, if you were a low-income person, you could not. There was no insurance that was readily available or help funded through the like national means, and so the Affordable Care Act made it where coverage was more accessible for low-income people. Now, you might have had some states that already had some social services going on, but to the extent that they were supported by other means was limited, and even within, when this act was passed, it was still, states were not required to buy into it. It was whether or not they wanted to get involved in the system. And then also during this time period, so not long after, we have 1966, which is the book written, Harry Benjamin wrote his book, the Transsexual Phenomenon, which is one of the first major U.S. Academic books, which basically discussed trans people and started to think of trans people rather as a psychological condition, and started to think of them more as a semantic or something that is within the body that can be corrected. And then also in 1971, we have Harry Benjamin writes a second book or second article that is highly influential and is in fact cited by several of the court cases that I go over. Basically, he writes an article in a in this psychology journal that basically states that within it he advocates that trans people should be able to access gender affirmative surgeries or sex change operations. And then we have our first few court cases in between 1975 and 1978. And so within the 70s, or towards the end of the 70s, we have our first few cases of trans people suing to access gender affirmative care. And within these, there was only, out of the four of them decided that the trans person should actually receive the care from the Medicaid or in the insurance, mainly because at this point states didn't have any rules or regulations that prohibited or made it so expressly that trans people shouldn't be able to access this care. And so, but then also, and then towards the end of the decade, we have our first standards of care that were passed in 1975. And then, so then I'm going to get, so kind of a broad overview of the next few decades of kind of changes that happen. That, so we start to see in the 80s, after a lot of states started to write in legislation that started to prohibit trans people being able to access this care after these first few cases where trans people actually did receive care through their insurance. So they started writing in language like experimental, or they started to put more regulations in defining what is truly trans, or what is, you know, how do you define who gets it, who it is appropriate care for, or just blanket denials of care. So anybody who tries to get gender affirmative surgeries or sex change operations during this time would blanketly be denied that care. And that goes on throughout the 80s, and then we see in the 90s, we start to see a shift where certain groups of people start to be able to access this care, and they're less likely to be denied, but then they start targeting different groups of people, so namely children and trans people who are incarcerated. And that continues on into the 2000s and slowly more and more where trans people who are adults, who aren't incarcerated, who aren't children, being able to access this care, and that continues into the 2010s and 2016s. So what is the sales pitch? What are some of the main arguments? There are a lot of arguments used. I went over, I don't know how many court cases I went over. It was, but there was a lot of different arguments used. So taxpayers were oftentimes used in these cases, and I like to call them biopolitical scapegoats. And I call them that because even the taxpayers were making claims about what the taxpayers would and wouldn't want to cover, stating that they wouldn't think that taxpayers would approve or think that trans care was appropriate, even without talking to the taxpayer or discussing, you know, what these surgeries actually mean. And so I'm calling them a biopolitical scapegoat because the people who are writing these laws, the judges, the lawyers, they're making claims about what should and shouldn't be covered, not based off of what people actually want. There's also discussions of who is truly trans. So part of the discussions that go on in these court cases is who's truly trans, and justifying this care for people who are actually trans versus people who are just saying they're trans, trying to justify and make valid certain types of identities of trans to justify this kind of care. And within that, we have a conversation of medical expertise. So medical experts are the source of whether or not trans people can receive this care. Like I was saying earlier, within these conversations, within these court cases, trans people are almost excluded from the conversation. Their testimonies, their discussion in the courts are almost excluded compared to the medical experts who continue to get to speak for trans people. So in a sense, they're the value creators in these cases. So with that, I want to jump to the very first court case that I reviewed. So this case happened in 1975. It was between the New York State Department of Social Services, who denied care for Denise, which is not her real name. But so initially she was denied care, and they stated off of medical basis. However, the court eventually overturned it because they did not provide any medical evidence. So trans people, so this particular trans woman ended up receiving this care. And so, but I wanted to draw light to a couple of quotes from that text to showcase some of the ways that these values are created. So we have medical expert. So I'll just read this off to you. The medical basis denial of petitioner's application appears to be without substance, as the agency offered no independent medical evidence, and it representative of the fair hearing admitted that it has never made a medical examination of petitioner. In the absence of other medical evidence to define and support the term medical basis, the determination of respondents' lack of rational foundation, and therefore the denial of medical assistance, was arbitrary and capricious. So within this, we see that medical expertise is put forward as the main basis for whether or not this type of surgery should be covered. We also see within this, there's just going back to, there's no legal or kind of going arguments that are available, or precedents as far as how people make arguments against or for these types of surgeries. And so under these circumstances, the court couldn't necessarily deny care, even though, and I'll show in a sec how they wanted to basically deny this care in this case, because this judge was not happy about stating that this trans person should receive care. And then they also have a conversation of this idea of truly trans. So the evidence further indicates that petitioner was a true transsexual for whom surgery was recommended. Again, they basically showed medical evidence, and they talked to the medical expert within this case to determine that the trans person was in fact somebody who should receive this kind of care. And then this was the quote that I thought, so this particular quote kind of showcases this idea of the taxpayer, or the taxpayer as the scapegoat. The legislator certainly never intended to authorize the payment of some substantial public funds for the dubious sex change operation here in question. The majority decision will, I fear, open the door to an inconceivable variety of claims by persons who are frustrated, depressed, and cosmetically impaired. And this kind of sentiment, was fairly common during this time. There was other cases in which the judge basically made similar claims as far as either people were going to come in and start demanding more extreme types of surgeries, or that they were going to be taking advantage of funds funds from other people who might be needing it from the Medicaid system. And they also seem to have this even within this kind of conversation, both a concern for the taxpayer, but then an antagonistic relationship with the taxpayer, being this group of people that would eventually try to take advantage of the system, even though they were concerned that they wouldn't have enough to take care of these same people in that system. But like I was saying before, we kind of see this, even though in the 70s we see several of these cases being approved by the court system, we start to see a shift in the 80s. And so even though the first case I'm going to be looking at was in the 77, I want to draw attention to it's a multi-case legal battle between Rush and the Georgia Department of Medicaid. So these cases spanned between 1977 and 1983. The initial denial of this particular case was based off of Georgia's new laws that they passed, which basically excluded transsexual operations. The exact quote from their legislation is, "Reimbursement will not be made for the following: cosmetic surgeries and experimental surgeries, e.g. transsexual operations." And so this sparked a multi-stage battle, and I'll share what ends up happening. But within these, we see again these similar arguments. So we have a conversation of the medical expert again, and what is truly trans. So within this case, Rush receives a diagnosis from his psychiatrist and neurologist. The diagnosis that this case is, sorry, I misgendered Rush, I'm sorry. The diagnosis in this case is definitely that of transsexual. She has made a mature decision in regards to sex reassignment surgery. I feel that such surgery is urgently indicated because of the feeling of despair and frustration which has made it has in regard to her condition. There is no approach other than surgery which can alleviate her depression and remove the threat of suicide. So again, we have a conversation of the medical expert basically stating what the surgery means and how it will help Rush through this process. And what it means to actually be trans is you have to have you have to be within this state of being both mature enough, right? You have to be well enough to be able to make this decision for yourself, and you have to be so unwell that you need this in the first place. And then we also, so in the next case, so with this first one, basically, at the end of it, Rush is denied. Was denied care in this first case, which brought up to an appeals court in the next one. And so this also brings up a point that was starting to come up in a lot of these cases as well, was this concept of experimental. So the Georgia Department of Medical Assistance has banned against making payments for experimental treatments because such treatments is not medically necessary, and that transsexual surgeries is experimental forms of treatment, i.e. treatment not generally recognized as effective by the medical profession. And so this started to come about in the 1980s, this kind of argument, not just by Georgia Department, but a lot of different states were starting to make these arguments that these surgeries were experimental. And so even though there was already history of these surgeries not being considered experimental. People had been doing research on these kinds of surgeries for years. They had already been doing them since the 1920s. And so as early as the 1920s, as far as being accessible, that's a different question. But So when they were saying that they're experimental, it also was coming out of this time period because in 1979, we have Johns Hopkins Medical Clinic that closed down. And that definitely played into this because, and I'll share in the next quote from one of these cases, but they actually cite one of the psychiatrists that helped close down the Johns Hopkins Clinic. And so this directly lines up with what was going on in the trans medical history at this time. And so we also see this as part of what I'm dubbing new experts. So you have all these people who had already been studying trans people, and then you have this shift where people who didn't approve of it or hadn't been involved in the literature or didn't like the idea of trans people started to use their medical expertise to basically do new studies or make claims about trans people being illegitimate and not, or just that there's other ways of treating people who are trans. So this particular quote, Dr. Meyer, this is the doctor that I'm talking about. He was one of the people who started to shut down the Johns Hopkins Clinic, but this is the quote from this case. So Dr. Meyer now believes that the question whether the surgery is safe in terms of the psychological status of the patient remains unanswered. He believes firmly that surgery is not any more effective than the passage of time. This view is based on his clinical experience that transsexuals and on his empirical research on transsexuals. Excuse me. In fact, he conducted a particular study where he looked at trans patients that had received the surgery and looked at their mental status a few years after receiving the surgery compared to people who had not received the surgery. And his conclusion was that their mental state was just as bad, if not necessarily worse, but just in the same state, without necessarily thinking through the fact that they were trans in the 80s. But that being said, to wrap up these court cases with Rush, so I'm sorry, I misspoke. So Rush won the first two trials, but lost the last one. The court ruled that transsexual operations were experimental and not recognized by the medical community, and largely because of Meyer's own quotes within that, and being a reputable person in the Johns Hopkins Clinic. Other treatments were considered effective at that time, and when he was saying time, he was talking about conversion therapy, right? So we're not talking about actually helping trans people accept who they are, but rather accept what the circumstances of their conditions, right? And saying like this is trying to convince them that this is as good as it's going to get. But this particular case, Rush is oftentimes cited by future cases, mainly because this conversation of experimental keeps coming up. And that kind of leads to the 90s. So I picked this case for this time period. And so we have John Smith, who was denied care for his bottom surgery in Iowa. And so part of what's interesting about John Smith's condition or case is that John Smith was in a nearly fatal car accident in the 70s. In that accident, he received some damage to his larynx and his spinal cord, causing him to have some speech impairment and also damage to his spinal cord caused him to have some hallucinations and hearing voices. Because of that, though, they would continue to deny and basically make it where they didn't think that Smith was able to make decisions as to whether or not this kind of procedure was appropriate for him or whether or not he was ready for it. But in the end, Smith did receive payment for his surgery. after the court ruled that legislation so that basically ruling that Iowa's legislation conflicted with federal regulations. And so within this case, though, we see a lot of the similar things that I've been talking about. So we have the conversation of the taxpayer again, but this time the judge starts to question this argument and starts to say and says this. Furthermore, the director's assertion of a flood of sex reassignment surgery cases is belied by the fact that in the 15 years after the Pink decision, this was an earlier Iowa case with another trans person, Pink decision required Iowa's Medicaid program to pay for sex reassignment surgery. There were only 2 claims of payment for such procedures, one by a plaintiff in Pinkin and one in 1991. It seems likely that the court that more money was spent out of Medicaid's limited resources attempting to prevent payment for sex reassignment surgery than would have been spent paying claims for such procedures during the same period of time. And this kind of argument continues to, at least for adult trans people, continue to be the case. They stopped denying that, or started to question this idea that so many trans people would be wanting to get this care and that it would be such a burden on the taxpayer, compared to the fact that most of these surgeries, most of this care is a one-time kind of instance for trans people. It's not something that's a recurring instance where trans people are coming for multiple surgeries and taking up a lot of resources that way. Another thing that starts to change in actually not change. This is something that continues to be the same. But this conversation of truly trans continues to be part of this conversation, so defining who fits into this category of truly trans and these definitions of it. So they talk about symptoms of this, right? And so part of the symptoms are I'll just read it. The symptoms of this disorder have persisted since childhood. Since Smith reached adulthood, the disorder has not responded to other treatment to the extent Dr. Cavalier or the director suggests that Smith has or may have other conditions instead of gender identity disorder. The court simply does not find their evidence to be credible. So again, for this case, it's a little bit different, mainly because Smith had some other things going on. Excuse me. But we see that this argument of persistence of the symptoms as part of the diagnosis for it. And again, talking about the, so again, the medical expert also has a say over whether or not, Smith is ready to receive this kind of care. We also return to the concept of the new expert. Here too, there are appropriate screening standards adhered to by the subsequently subspecialty of practitioners devoted to treating gender identity disorder, the Harry Benjamin standards. Although sex reassignment surgeries may be relatively unknown, at least outside of the community of professionals actively involved in the treatment of gender identity disorder, there is sufficient authoritative evidence that sex reassignment surgeries is both safe and effective at treating or treatment for extreme cases of gender identity disorder, which do not respond to psychological or other treatment. So at this point, we start to see that those arguments put out by the new experts are starting to be questioned or put down, and recognizing that the experts who are knowledgeable in this field are those who work with trans patients on a daily basis and have been immersed in the literature for a while. We also see towards the end of this case a shift in how we describe experimental. So the transgender child becomes the idea of what is experimental, and in this case they cite Dr. Stafferfield, who has the opinion that only one form of sex reassignment surgery is experimental, and that is surgical and hormonal reassignment of children in their early teens, a procedure not currently being done anywhere in the United States. Within this too, which is interesting context as far as trans medicine going on at this time, is we have the work out of the Netherlands, which they have been basically working with trans kids since the 80s, basically coming up with hormonal therapies or hormone suppressors. And so a particularly important article during this time that came out was in 1998. It was titled Puberty Delay as an Aid in Diagnosis and Treatment for Transsexual Adolescents. And so this is important because this was going on as far as conversations about the legitimacy of these kinds of procedures for trans kids, or access to hormone blockers for trans kids, which was already going on in other places in the world, but only was on the periphery in the US talking about this. But so part of this talking about what is experimental is also coming out of this other part of trans medicine going on. And some of this doesn't start to come officially to the United States until 2007. But another part of the shift that I've been alluding to in these later cases is a shift towards trans people who are incarcerated. Kukui was denied access to the same level of estrogen that she had been accustomed to prior to being imprisoned. Upon entering prison, the medical director at her particular prison denied her the same level of estrogen, which actually directly contradicted the laws that the Bureau of Prison have, which is that transsexual inmates have the level of change existing upon admissions to the Bureau. This case has a few instances where it keeps coming up. There's a few back and forth cases with this. But a particular quote that I want to draw attention to is this, and it's talking about the incarcerated. So the standards of being trans as an incarcerated person are not the same as those who are outside of the prison system. Dr. Baracco, I'm going to say Baracco, told Kukua that she would not get any synthetic estrogen because, not yet having undergone surgery, she was not a true or genuine transsexual. He said that the Bureau of Prison policy applies only to true transsexuals. So this is completely different than what other standards of care are, which basically state that you have to go on hormones first for a while before that you can get any type of surgeries. So him claiming that she hasn't gone through any type of bottom surgery is denying what the actual standards of care are. In another case, we see how prisoners are treated different than trans people outside of the prison system. So another case that happened in 2010, several inmates from the Wisconsin's Department of Corrections were neglected to receive gender affirmative care, which they claimed violated their 14th Amendment right to equal protection and their 8th Amendment right to freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. During this time, these inmates were responding to a new act that Wisconsin passed, Act 105, which it's titled Inmate Sex Change Prevention Act, which again directly contradicted the Bureau of Prisons laws that were in place. In the end, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, stating that the prisoners with a gender identity disorder were treated differently from other prisoners because of their medical condition. But within this, we see, so a quote that I want to draw particular attention to is a quote discussing the act itself, again talking about the taxpayer. The legislative sponsors issued multiple press releases prior to the passage, stating that it was intended to prevent bizarre taxpayer-funded sex change procedures, and to stop the DOC policy of allowing pharmacists with the correction system. Pharmacists within the correction system to give hormones to an inmate diagnosed with gender identity disorder. So again, we see where the taxpayer is used as an excuse for not wanting to pay for these procedures for trans people who are incarcerated. So what I'm trying to draw to light here is that we see these kinds of arguments coming to an end in the late 90s, early 2000s, but are retaken up for a new population of people. And to kind of tie it back up for y'all, I want to talk about another TV drama. So in 2002, ER had its own transgenders episode. And in this episode, it depicts a trans girl whose father dies in a car accident while she's in the hospital. And towards the end of the episode, this child doesn't want to go back to her mother, mainly because her mother and her father were divorced, and so she didn't want to go back to her mother because her mother was going to make her detransition. And so within this episode, we see this argument again of what the the dilemma within the medical system. Again, it comes back, it still comes up, but this time it's not on trans adults, it's on trans children. And I don't have a picture of it, but also during this time period, right, we have another depiction of a trans person, very visible, is Laverne Cox in Orange is the New Black. This depiction of a trans person is, again, incarcerated. It's not in other ways that this type of trans person is depicted. And so, yeah, so just to conclude kind of what I've shared with you all today, medical experts are oftentimes given the power to say what is medically necessary, what is legitimate or appropriate care, and this legitimacy is dependent on pathology. So we define trans people based on how we pathologize them. So if medical experts are the only ones who can say that trans people are legitimate and valuable, then they're always going to be pathologized. And again, I want to draw draw a point to the fact that trans care, it gets the arguments against trans care continue to be recycled. And part of this is that part of the argument is this pathologization, and if we can continue to make trans people based off of these medicalized categories, then they're going to continue to be pathologized, they're going to continue to be marginalized, and there's still going to be room for these arguments to come up again and again. Again, and this is dependent on who is afforded to be assimilated or included into these categories and who's not. So yeah, that's all I have for you guys, and I'm happy to answer questions or, yeah, thank you.
Amazing. So we are going to open the floor to questions. I will be monitoring Zoom. You can either raise your hand on Zoom, stick it in the chat, and I'll read it out. And so can I tap you to help me move the microphones on the room? Amazing. So raise your hand if you have a question.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. I came in a bit late, so apologies if I missed this. I was really interested in your data sources, and so I was curious if all of the cases centered around Medicaid, and if they were, and if that was part of the decision, and if not, I guess I was just interested thinking about the history of health insurance in the United States during the same period of time that you're tracking. 2010 was, of course, the Affordable Care Act, when we got a Medicaid expansion. And so part of what was in the public discourse was about how, people deserve care and poor people deserve care, and we should, in fact, extend it to people who are slightly above the poverty line, because the poverty line is meaningless. And so the transition to trans medicine or trans prisoners was really interesting because it looked like it found the next most marginalized group. So poor people don't deserve health care, and then of course prisoners don't deserve health care. And so I guess I was just curious how you were thinking about how stigmatization or pathologization or whatever connects with marginalization along these other axes like class or poverty or incarceration.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. That's a great question. So first, it just ended up working out that way. Most of the cases just were against Medicaid and Medicare. I had a handful that were against like Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, but most of them were against Medicaid and Medicare. And why that happened, that's a really good question. I don't have a good answer for that. But as far as how I think about pathologization and marginalization, this is why I kind of wanted to think about this as a market and thinking about it as a sociology of economics, is if you have money, you can change your body. If you have a right to do whatever you want with your body because you've kind of shown that you are contributing or doing something enough to the society that you can do whatever you want to your body. And so I think throughout this is an argument of whether or not these are rights and affordances that everybody should be able to have. And so I guess that's how I kind of think about this. It's like marginalization is both tied up to class, and so the stigma ends up being, if you're a lower class, if you're a person who is lower income, you aren't afforded the same privileges, the same rights as somebody who has the means to do so. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Well, I think we have people online. So Leora?
Hi. Congratulations, Lyndon. This is really so wonderful to hear. This is my question. I'm curious how you think it matters kind of analytically and otherwise that these arguments about legitimacy are getting recycled specifically in the process of adjudicating payment as opposed to the process of adjudicating hospital policy or standards of care or something else. And I'm curious what you find in these cases that might tell us something about that.
Yeah. That's a really good one, Leora. So as far as, I guess when I was thinking about looking at the court cases in particular, and I'm not, as far as, this is just one kind of, I guess, stab at the depathologization. I see this project as just one kind of take at it. But I suppose when I initially was proposing looking at court cases, specifically looking at accessing insurance and people being able to pay for these kinds of procedures, I guess, again, kind of going back to the last question, I wanted to address the fact that if you have means, it's not a question, you can still get these procedures. And so when I was picking out the court, deciding to go through the court cases, I wanted to know, how did people make arguments for these procedures, not to the medical providers who are somewhat incentivized to be able to provide these cares. Because if you can provide this care, you can get money to do it, right? It's more of, if you don't have means to pay to the medical provider, how do you justify this to other people? How do you justify this to the wider population of people who are conceivably helping to pay for this, right? Because that's part of the Medicaid system or the insurance system is, right, we're helping subsidize other people being able to access care that they otherwise couldn't pay for themselves. And so I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, Leora, but I guess this is how I was thinking about this as far as a first stab of thinking about depathologization. And I think it ties up nicely with, it ties up with my other parts of this argument as far as, trying to tie it back to my other chapters, which discuss how trans people value these things and how these arguments line up with how trans people think about these procedures and the value of these procedures in their own life. And to answer your question a little bit more, Leora, I also, it definitely would benefit to talk about the arguments within standards of care and other, like medical journals and things like that. I just haven't had time to do that.
Christine? And then we'll go back on the.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you, Lyndon. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I have one quick question, which is, and maybe I misunderstood or didn't follow it properly, but why did Rush, if Rush won the first 2 times, why was there a third? Like, if they were winning, why were they continuing to sue?
Because I believe because Georgia was denied. They wanted to.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I just missed
Yeah.
that.
No, I probably didn't explain that
Okay.
quite right. Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to value and just was wondering whether, again, like in having read the cases more than we got to learn about, we only got a little bit, but you've engaged with them more. Is there more discussion or language that's either explicitly using the concept of value or that you're gleaning the kind of a use or kind of explanation in value terms, like is gender affirming treatment more valuable to the taxpayer if the person is truly trans? Like, is there a kind of compounded sort of value? And so, or if somebody is, in the argument in the case that was this person is so desperate, they're going to potentially, we don't know what they'll do if we don't give them the surgery. Therefore, this is valuable. Like, is that anywhere in the case, like, the case, the discussion?
Yeah, definitely. And and Daniel and Cora can attest to this because they saw my notes. I have a lot of values that are picked out. Again, they're not expressly described as values, right? Like that is, my kind of intellectual choice to think of it through values. But within these court cases, it does come up, like they talk about, and again, it's the medical provider talking about the value of what these procedures do for somebody who's truly trans, right? Like it makes them capable of socializing or getting jobs or being functional people in society, and also talk about it's not as much as I thought it would be. I thought there'd be more conversation about suicide and things like that, but that didn't come up as much. It was more about functionality. And on the flip side, there were negative arguments that people made too, as far as, I don't want people to be trans because I don't want a trans person in my workplace. I don't want to be confused. I want my employees to be confused. Things like that came up. So there's a whole host of other values that came up. I just I picked the ones that seem to be coming up the most, and also the ones that seem to have regurgitate, the ones that seem to come up again. And so that's kind of how I landed on these particular ones, but there's a lot of values, there's a lot of arguments that come up in these court cases for sure. Yeah.
Silas and your cat?
Kitty first.
It's true. Rosemary loves to participate in intellectual discourse. Lyndon, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. I think you gave us so much to think about, and that is partially represented by the fact that Leora and Christine took the 2 questions that I wanted to ask. So I'm just going to mention them very quickly, and then I did come up with a 3rd question that I wanted to ask you. But with recycled and precedents that you mentioned in your conclusion, I thought that was a really great connection to make, because I wondered, we know when it comes to precedent and the way that the US legal system works, precedent carries a lot of weight in terms of future cases, and you said that a couple of times in your talk. But I also wondered if recycled is a way of thinking about the market, that there's this idea that the market will forget previous framings of cases with regards to how people are talking about trans surgeries. And then when it came to the Rush cases, I wasn't sure if you were talking about different types of surgeries that Rush was trying to get approved, because then I wondered how that might be affecting the market when we think about trans surgeries as one-offs, or not a part of a connected set of procedures that speak to the same embodied experience. And so my actual question for you is, it's an invitation if you would like to, if you want to say more about how the surgeries that trans men and trans women experience or request, or typically the way that the medical field understands the differences between the surgeries that trans men and trans women have, and if you saw that shaping the rhetoric in the cases themselves.
Yeah. So as for the Rush case itself, so it was bottom surgery, but as far as I mean, a fair host of them were trans women. I will say that, but as far as so the Smith case, for example, that one was a trans man that was trying to get bottom surgery, and we see that even though those 2 cases are about a different kind of surgery, we still see some of the same arguments coming up. And so there seems to be almost lumping together that happens of these surgeries by the kinds of arguments that are made about them. So whether or not somebody should get these are kind of lumped together as, well, you kind of get this package of procedures, and at that point you are now this new gender, you're this new sex, right? And so while if you talk, there's definitely a difference between if you actually speak with a medical provider about these surgeries, right? If you're a trans person trying to get these procedures, there is going to be a different kind of conversation about, what stage are you at? How many, especially in early, especially in the 2000s and earlier than that, there's going to be a conversation of steps to getting to that point where you can get those surgeries. But as far as making these broad arguments as to whether or not these types of surgeries are legitimate, there seems to be a focus on them being just the transsexual, transgender surgery. Like it's this kind of you just go into the surgery room, you go in one gender and you come out another gender, and so while there's like a logistical truth behind actually getting these procedures and medical experts learning them and knowing how to provide them, there's another thing as far as the arguments they make for them. Hopefully that kind of answers that.
Ashley?
Hey, my son Zeph is going to ask our question.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so these cases were really cool. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. Yeah. I was wondering, given your research, if you were hired as a consultant by Medicaid or another insurance company to advise on rules around gender affirming care, what kind of advice would you give them?
That's a really good one. Well, I guess first, I guess I would say have less barriers. Believe the people who are asking for the care. Somebody tells you what they are, believe them. But as far as, I mean, this is tough because I also have a lot of opinions about insurance in general as far as like a mechanism to providing care. But I guess also just continually being in conversation with lots of different experts. So not just talking to medical experts, but also talking to trans people themselves. You know, so if you want to provide particular kind of care to a particular kind of person, you should ask them directly what that care should look like and how they want to access it. And maybe talk to them about how to make the process easier, how to put information forward for them to be able to access it more easily. Yeah, I think that would be mine, is just to keep talking to people, because these things change. How we talk about them change. And so if you want to be able to continue to actually provide care to people, you got to keep asking people how their care is going.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
Lee?
Is this on? It is? Okay. Lyndon, I love this project. I've loved it since you first articulated it to me in research methods, and it's great, man. It really is.
Thanks.
I have two questions for you. One is, I really loved your taxpayer scapegoat idea, because I think it's nice kind of about how we construct publics, and that's done all the time via law and policy making, right? And there's literatures on that we can get into. I think the taxpayer stuff, I think, is conservative coded in the United States. The phrase is usually taxpayer dollars and then there's an obsession with that. So I think you could go a little deeper on that front, maybe thinking about the conservative politics of that term in particular. But I was also wondering, like, there's a rub for me because on the other hand, you have states that are passing laws against this stuff, right? And that continues right up to today. So in a kind of federalist system, you're going to have some polities that are actually choosing, like, not to go down this road, right? They're passing laws to ban it in various ways. So sometimes that language might not, I mean, I like your rub that it's not actual empirics driving the rhetoric, right? It is a kind of rhetoric. They don't know. They haven't, they're not studying surveys or whatever, right? But on the other hand, like, there are polities where maybe they're not that far off. Maybe they actually are representing pretty much what their people think, what most people in that state think. So I just wonder, my first question is how you deal with that kind of rub between, like, democracy and the construction of publics. My second one's, like, way lighter and just is an invitation for you to riff, which is just, like, can you give us some, like, titillating previews of, like, what you're finding in the other sections of the dissertation that you didn't talk about?
Sure. So I'll try to answer your hard one first. I guess, I mean, yeah, because I think that's a fair point, right? That, the legislators and the judges might actually be pretty representative of how most of the people in a place like Iowa are feeling. But as far as how do you combat that? I mean, I think that's like, right? That's not. That's a question of how do you show humanity? I guess is like, how do you communicate that to people who have never, like, even met a trans person, and the only exposure to trans people are these incendiary, kinds of, crazy transgender, surgery, right? Like, even within the writing of the legislation, they use these kinds of terms. And so I think it becomes a question of how do you, like, on the ground floor, like grassroots movements, how do you get trans people in or there's just more visibility of trans people that doesn't scare people. Because I think that that's like part of it, right? Like there's so much fear around trans people, and now that people are changing your kids into being trans, and so, which I don't necessarily like. I don't address in my project necessarily is how do we, you know, what are some of the grassroots movements that have helped to kind of change this type of rhetoric, and how do you get the general populace to be on trans people's side? I mean, I know that I know some people who do that kind of work, and it's hard. It's a lot of putting yourself out there. It's a lot of vulnerability as a trans person to show your humanity on the grassroots, and so that's a you know, that's a project in and of itself. And I know there's other scholars that are doing this kind of work, like Chris Hoffman. Am I saying his last name right? But anyways, that's a lot of what his book is, right? Care Without Pathology. And so then that work's not easy, especially with people who have more funds, more organization, to basically have these large campaigns to make these claims that trans people are bad, that they are mentally unwell, and they have the tropes already. We already have so many of these tropes that trans people are they're tricksters, trans people are mentally unwell. And so it's easy to build these kinds of campaigns against trans people, and it's a lot harder to make them seem less scary. So I don't know if that answers that question as well as maybe you'd like. It's definitely something to think about, though, as far as like my proposed kind of goal of this project is to think through that diffusion from the people writing the policies and the people that these policies indirectly affect, or have massive, or have, you know, kind of say over what the politicians, you know, kind of agenda. And in answering that question, I forgot your second question.
Just like, what are some cool things you're finding in the other parts of it?
Okay, thanks. So, I mean, so my interviews have been, I've really enjoyed the interview portion of my project, which is my chapter 3. I guess some of the things that I'm kind of finding out on this more sad side, some of these arguments that I've kind of showcased in this part of my project seem to come up as justification or reasons for why trans people want these surgeries for themselves, which is a little, you know, disappointing. But on the more positive side, these surgeries are this kind of, they sit inside this space that is both, it's both self-actualizing, but then also like socially self-actualizing. So there's more space for people to be themselves, and there's kind of this beauty of it. And when I talk to trans people, they get to talk about, and that's why I love these interviews with them, is because they get to talk about how much these surgeries have impacted their lives for the positive, and how much more they feel like themselves, and how they're able to connect with people better. And this isn't necessarily new, but it's just something that whenever I get into these conversations with trans people, it's just kind of beautiful, and I love getting to talk about just how much better their lives are, just from these procedures. And so that's, at least from the interviews, that's still definitely a work in progress as far as like some of my findings. But as far as my second chapter, it's just confusing. The market itself, how to access it, all these different forces. I have a chart somewhere that is of the market, and I've shown it in course class. But it's just, yeah, in fact, I'll show it to you. But this is, I don't know if people can see the screen. But this is from my market. So the actual process of getting the surgery and having to deal with stigma and state policies and your social network and expenses, and so I have the different forces that are involved with the process, and yeah, so I enjoyed making this, and it's just confusing, and I kind of love it. So, but yeah, I've for all the terrible things about it, it's a fun project.
Ace?
Hi, Lyndon. Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. I learned a lot. I'm really looking forward to your research going further. One of the things that I found interesting so I haven't read Harry Benjamin, and I thought that it was interesting how you discussed sort of like his understanding of transness as somatic rather than psychological, which makes sense that he would then start to argue for surgery and like bodily changes from that. And I also thought that it was quite interesting how there's this normalization of the non-normative through these legal processes as well as medical procedures that start to create these definitions or concepts of what transness is. And you talked about the future of trans care hopefully being non-pathological care. And so like there is this medical understanding of transness that's defined through these policies and procedures. And then it sounds like there's also these other sort of conceptions of what transness might mean from a psychological or a somatic kind of construction. I'm wondering if you can speak more about sort of different understandings of transness that might exist outside of the medical or pathological model.
Yeah.
And what might be something that is non-pathological but at the same time like validates and like doesn't deny how valuable these medical procedures are for trans people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Well, and that is the question. And so I don't know if I have exactly a good answer for the end of your question, Ace. But as far as there is a really good book that helped kind of inspire my project, and I am spacing on what the title of the book is right now. But basically, this anthropologist goes into these clubs in the late 90s and early 2000s. This David Valentine. Yeah. Yep. Thank you, Christine. But basically, he goes into these clubs and talks to predominantly trans people of color, and how he's asking them questions about whether or not they consider them transsexual, transgender, and so a lot of them didn't even have this in their vernacular. They had all these other terms to describe themselves. And so basically what this book catalogs is this flattening of a trans identity. And because within the queer community, there are so many different ways that trans people were able to identify and express themselves, and they've all been flattened down to this umbrella term of transgender. And so that was kind of part of my conceiving of this project, is how do we actually make it more of a rainbow again? How do we actually take trans people from not being this flattened identity? And so, I mean, this is why I'm wanting to talk to trans people, and why I will continue to talk to trans people, because talking to the trans people that I have, it is amazing how their different ideas in themselves are different outside of these things, even if they wouldn't describe it that way themselves. And I don't want to, I also don't want to talk for them necessarily, but I also would love to have a wider conversation of what it means to be trans and how we define these things. Yeah, so I think that answers your main question, but just as a little more context, Harry Benjamin actually was a German psychologist, and he actually worked with, there was an older clinic in Germany that actually, when the Nazis took over, got burnt down. It was the famous book burning was actually a sexology clinic. And so Harry Benjamin came from Germany and brought some of his knowledge from this sexology clinic, and that's how he started to do some of this work. And so this kind of understanding actually came from Germany and developed, and our own area of sexology came out of that tradition. So just as a little context to your original question.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask a question that Janet threw in the chat. She says, I'm wondering if there was any difference in the sense of legitimacy for male to female and female to male transitions.
Yeah. Well, so as I was saying a little earlier, so it was a lot more cases were male to female, especially in the earlier cases. But as far as legitimacy, as far as within the courts, they didn't differentiate. It was, these arguments were built out of, if you're trans, you need to have the trans surgery. If you, trans. So it was more dependent on whether or not you fit these other criteria, as far as, did you have these feelings from early on in life? Did you, follow the correct procedures to get this kind of care? Did you, how long have you been dressing? Have you dressed as the opposite gender for a while? Did you go on hormones for the correct amount of time? Those types of hoops or milestones in receiving care seem to be more important rather than which gender you started out as and the one that you ended up in. If that kind of answers your question, Janet.
It's on? Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about the role of pharmaceutical or biomedical industry in this conversation, because I can imagine, well, first, because I know that medical experts often they are the face of pharmaceuticals and biomedical, and they are the ones that help them to structure the arguments against or in favor of something that they want. And since you are talking about a market here, I can see ways in how the trans medical care could become a good thing for pharmaceuticals or a burden. So I wonder if in those conversations, historical conversation and legal cases, they have a role or some lobby that you find. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. As far as in the courts themselves, it's mainly they usually find some type of expert so the lawyers usually find some type of expert for the particular case, and use them as like an expert witness within the courtroom. But as far as like lobbyists or pharmaceutical companies coming into these spaces, it's usually not them directly. It's usually some type of medical expert that's working, in a gender clinic, or, a psychiatrist in that particular area that has been asked to come in as an expert witness. But as far as the market in a wider sense, there's definitely other authors that do some of the work that you're talking about a little bit more than I'm doing right in this. So like Steph Schuster's work talks quite a bit about this, and talks about these kinds of negotiations in the medical field, both with pharmaceutical companies, not so much pharmaceutical companies, but more of like these medical organizations that have these conversations of legitimacy and how whether or not this kind of care should be provided. And then another book that does this is Testo Junkies, which is a book written by another trans person. I forget their name, but that book basically talks about the ways that trans people almost become dependent on and reliant on the pharmaceutical companies as a means of continuing to receive care. And I guess in ways that this kind of shows up in my own work is, right, in some ways, the insurance companies are more likely to want to have this care being able to be accessed, and because they get more money, right, from providing it than rather denying it. And so, and they want, if you're getting your insurance through a private provider, they would rather that you still be able to receive it rather than get denied it. And so, I wish I had a better answer for you, but yeah.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left. So Mark, I think your last question.
Great talk, Lyndon. Very interesting. Just going to the historic context that you presented, something I think I didn't fully understand, and the question came out of that, which is about the medical professionals kind of having an opinion on which then dictates the norms in a way. So where they denied people this sort of treatment and the surgeries, does that mean that it was just they were denied this sort of subsidized insured system and they had to go to a much more expensive option? Or does it mean that they are denied full stop and they cannot legally get this help? And do they then go to some kind of like black market, sort of unregulated solution? And if there was some kind of like unregulated black market, did the presence of that in any way change the kind of development more general in the society of kind of acceptance of transgender healthcare?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in these cases, also, thanks for calling in from very cold outside. It looks like you look bundled up. So in these cases, when they've been denied care, they conceivably could go get this care somewhere else. The problem is whether or not they could, save up enough funds to be able to afford these providers. So the providers can still give the care. So the surgeons can still provide the care. It's not like they're legally prevented from getting it. But there's definitely a black market for these procedures and accessing hormones. In fact, there's lots of instances of. So you'll hear stories about trans people trying to get these procedures on black markets and having to go either get corrective surgeries from somebody or having to go get, having an emergency type of situation from a bad black market surgery. Especially in these earlier cases where they were still working on these technologies, there was, instances where trans women would get, breast implants or butt implants, and the particular implant they put in was the wrong kind of silicone, and it started to go bad on them, and so they had to go into like these emergency situations, or they had to go try to get these surgeries redone. In fact, one of my cases I have is an instance where a trans woman initially got her surgery denied, and so went and got it done from another provider, and it didn't go correctly, and so she was trying to get her Medicaid to pay for the reconstruction of it, and had to go through the courts to get it done, because at that point it wasn't so much about she had already had the surgery done. She had already been living a long time as a trans woman and having these breasts as a part of her life, and basically making the claim that I have been living as this person for a while, and so you denying me this care is on par with denying this care of a cis woman. And so, yeah, definitely a black market out there if you're looking, Mark.
And on that note. All right. Well, thank you. Let's thank Lyndon for a really wonderful talk. you want to close us out in any way?
Yeah, I will. Next week, we have an external scholar, Colleen Kerrigan, coming in from the University of Virginia. She's going to be talking about her book, Cracking the Bro Code. So see you next Friday here at 1:30, same location.